Power is a dangerous drug, and in the sterile, anonymous corridors of an airport, it can be wielded with impunity. For one TSA agent, a man nursing a lifetime of grievances, his uniform was a shield and his authority a weapon. He believed he was the gatekeeper, the final word on who was and was not a threat. One Tuesday morning, he set his sights on a sharply dressed black woman whose calm confidence he found unnerving. He decided to make an example of her, to unravel her composure piece by piece. But he never imagined that in trying to strip her of her dignity, he was picking a fight with a force of justice that would not only dismantle his career, but expose the rotten foundation of his entire world. This isn't just a story about an airport screening. It's about the moment a bully in a position of power discovers his target is the one who writes the rules. The air in Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 5:17 a.m. tasted of burnt coffee, floor wax, and the collective low-grade anxiety of thousands of travelers. It was a symphony of rolling luggage wheels, muffled announcements, and the soft, repetitive beep of boarding pass scanners. For Imani Jordan, it was just white noise, the necessary atmospheric price for the work that awaited her in Washington, D.C. She was a woman who moved with an economy of motion that bespoke discipline and purpose. Her charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored. Her leather briefcase held not just documents, but the weight of 100 families' hopes, and her shoes, sensible but stylish low heels, clicked on the polished linoleum with a quiet metronomic rhythm. Imani was not traveling for leisure. She was lead counsel in Thompson v. City of Northgate, a sprawling class action lawsuit alleging systemic racial profiling by the city's police department. The deposition she was flying to attend was with a former police chief, a man whose testimony could either crack the case wide open or bury it in a mountain of bureaucratic denial. Every detail mattered. That's why her travel routine was a well-oiled machine. Laptop out, liquids in the clear bag placed in the bin, shoes off, belt off, no jewelry except for the simple silver watch her father had given her, its face cracked from the day he'd dropped it years ago. She kept it as a memento mori, a reminder of time's fragility and the importance of her work. She placed her 3 gray bins onto the conveyor belt and gave them a gentle push. As she walked through the metal detector, it remained silent. She was collecting her first bin when a voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Ma'am, over here." Imani turned. The voice belonged to a TSA agent standing beside a small, sterile-looking alcove marked for additional screening. He was a man in his late 40s with a bulldog-like posture, a thick neck, broad shoulders, and a face that seemed permanently soured, as if he'd just bitten into a lemon. His name tag read M. Callahan. "Your bags have been selected for a random secondary search," he stated, his eyes flicking over her, from her neatly styled hair down to her heels, which were now sitting in the bin. The word random was delivered with an almost imperceptible smirk. Imani felt the familiar, weary tightening in her chest. It was the feeling every black person knew, the internal sigh that said, "Here we go again." She had been randomly selected more times than any of her white colleagues could ever recall being. It was a tax she paid for traveling while black. "Of course," she said, her voice even and betraying none of her internal frustration. She walked towards him, her poise a shield. Agent Mark Callahan watched her approach. He saw the expensive suit, the confident stride, the way she met his gaze without flinching, and he felt a familiar, ugly coil of resentment tighten in his gut. He'd been a cop once for a short, disastrous stint in a small town. He'd lacked the temperament, they said. What he lacked was the deference he felt he was owed. Now, in this airport, he had it. Here, his word was law. He was the gatekeeper, and he decided who passed without trouble. "Place your feet on the marks, ma'am," he instructed, gesturing to the faded yellow footprints on the floor. "I'm going to need to conduct a pat-down." Imani complied, her jaw set. She knew the procedure. She also knew the difference between a professional search and a performance of power. Callahan snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves with an audible, aggressive crack. He began the pat-down, his movements just a little too slow, his pressure just a little too firm. He ran his hands along her arms, her torso, pausing for a fraction of a second too long at her waist. It was a subtle act of intimidation, designed to unnerve, to assert dominance. Imani remained still, her breathing controlled. She was a litigator. She understood strategy. An emotional outburst was what he wanted. It would be his justification. She would give him nothing. Instead, she began documenting. Time, 5:24 a.m. Agent M. Callahan. Standard pat-down, performed with excessive pressure. All right, he grunted, finishing. Now the bags. He turned to her bins with a predatory focus. The first held her laptop and shoes. He swabbed them for explosives residue, the machine beeping a dull negative tone. He moved to the second bin, containing her coat and the clear bag of liquids. He opened the bag, picking up each bottle, her travel-sized moisturizer, her toothpaste, her contact lens solution, and scrutinized it as if it were a component of an improvised explosive device. This facial cream, he said, holding up the small tube. What's its purpose? The question was absurd. It was designed to be. It's for moisturizing my face, Imani replied, her voice still a placid lake. He squeezed a small amount onto his gloved finger, sniffed it, and wiped it on a cloth before dropping the tube back into the bin with a clatter. It was the third bin he was most interested in. It contained her briefcase. I'm going to need you to open this, ma'am. It contains privileged legal documents, Imani said, a clear line of warning in her tone. They are confidential attorney-client work products related to ongoing federal litigation. Callahan's lips curled into that same smug smile. Everything that comes through this checkpoint is subject to search, for security. Open it. With a deep, controlled breath, Imani undid the latches. The case was organized with the precision of a surgeon's tray. Manila folders, each neatly labeled. Thompson Depot prep, expert witness reports, forensic financials. Callahan didn't care about the labels. He cared about the violation. He began pulling out the folders, his thick fingers fumbling with the papers. He wasn't reading them, merely disrupting them, thumbing through pages, disorganizing her meticulous system. He was a vandal in her cathedral of order. Lots of paperwork for a little trip, he commented, the false folksiness of his tone grating on her nerves. It's my job, Imani said simply. He continued his search, his movements becoming more agitated, as if he was angry he hadn't found anything. He pulled out her pen case, her spare phone charger, a small pouch containing personal items. He unzipped it. Inside were tampons, a small bottle of ibuprofen, and a single sealed ornate silver cylinder, no bigger than her thumb. Callahan's eyes lit up. He had found it, the anomaly. He picked up the small cylinder. It was cool to the touch, engraved with a delicate filigree pattern. It was sealed shut. And what? He said, his voice dropping into a low, accusatory hum. Is this? That, Imani said, her voice softening for the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion breaking through. Is personal. It's a keepsake. What's inside it? He demanded, holding it up to the harsh fluorescent light. Imani hesitated. It's sealed. The question wasn't, is it sealed, ma'am? The question was, what's inside it? He shook it slightly next to his ear. A soft, whispery sound came from within. Feels like a powder, some kind of organic substance. The implication was clear, and it was disgusting. He was treating a sacred object like contraband. Agent Callahan, Imani said, her voice now dangerously quiet, the placid lake beginning to freeze over. I am telling you, that item is deeply personal. It poses no threat. It is not on any prohibited items list. I'll be the judge of what's a threat. He shot back, his authority now fully inflated. If you can't identify the substance, I have to treat it as an unknown, which means we have a problem. He placed the silver cylinder on the stainless steel table, separate from everything else. A piece of evidence. He looked at her, a triumphant glint in his eye. He thought he had her. He thought he had found the crack in her composure, the thing that would make her break. He had no idea that he hadn't just found a crack. He had just struck the match that would burn his entire world to the ground. A bubble of silence seemed to expand around the screening station, pushing the ambient airport noise to the periphery. The few travelers who noticed the standoff averted their eyes, eager to not be drawn into the vortex of whatever was happening. For them, it was a momentary inconvenience to be avoided. For Imani, it was a violation escalating in real time. For Agent Callahan, it was a validation of his power. An unidentified organic substance, Callahan repeated, savoring the official-sounding jargon. He tapped his gloved finger on the small silver tube. That's a security issue, a big one. Imani's gaze was fixed on the cylinder. It contained a small portion of her grandmother's ashes. Her grandmother, a woman who had scrubbed floors so her son could go to college, who had saved every spare dollar so her grandson, Imani's father, could have a better life. The woman who had told a young Imani, "Your mind is a weapon, child. Keep it sharp. Don't ever let anyone make you feel small." Having this man, this petty tyrant in a government uniform, handle that sacred vessel with such crude suspicion felt like a desecration. "It is not an unidentified organic substance," Imani said, her voice a low, vibrating wire of controlled fury. "I told you it was a keepsake." "A keepsake of what?" Callahan pressed, leaning in. He was enjoying this. He was peeling back the layers of her composure, and he was convinced he would find something rotten underneath. Imani's first instinct was to guard her grandmother's memory, to not offer up something so precious to be pawed at by this man's contempt. But she was also a strategist. Withholding the information would only give him more ammunition. "It contains human ashes," she said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Callahan blinked. It wasn't the answer he was expecting. For a microsecond, a flicker of something, surprise, disappointment, crossed his face. But it was quickly replaced by a renewed, even more obstinate suspicion. "Ashes," he repeated, his tone skeptical. "You're traveling with human remains in an unmarked container?" "It is marked," Imani countered, gesturing to the engravings. "With a pattern my grandmother loved. It is not a commercial urn, it is a personal reliquary. It is sealed, and it is not a threat." "That's not for you to decide, ma'am," he snapped. "We have protocols for transporting cremated remains. They need to be in a lightweight container that can be X-rayed. Wood, plastic, cardboard. Not a metal tube I can't see into. For all I know, you've mixed something in with those ashes." He let the last word hang in the air, dripping with disbelief. He was insinuating she was not only a liar, but was using the memory of a loved one as a shield for something illicit. It was a vile accusation, designed to be the final crushing blow to her dignity. The litigator in Imani took over completely. The pain receded, replaced by an ice-cold clarity. She was no longer just a granddaughter defending an heirloom. She was an officer of the court observing a gross abuse of authority. Documentation, 5:31 a.m. Agent Callahan is questioning the nature of cremated remains in a sealed container. Accusatory and unprofessional tone, implying illicit substances are mixed with the remains. This is no longer a search, it is harassment. "Agent Callahan," she began, her tone shifting. It was no longer defensive. It was the voice she used in depositions when she had a witness cornered. "Are you a trained expert in the identification of human ashes?" He was taken aback by the question. "I'm a transportation security officer." "That is not what I asked," Imani continued, her eyes boring into his. "I asked if you have any specific forensic training that would allow you to visually distinguish cremated human remains from, and I'm quoting you, an unidentified organic substance." "I have my training," he blustered, his face reddening slightly. "I know what looks suspicious." "So, to be clear for the record," Imani said, her voice clear and precise, "your basis for this entire escalation is that this container looks suspicious to you personally, despite the fact that I, the owner of the property, have identified its contents to you." The word record hung in the air. Callahan's smirk faltered. He was used to people getting angry, getting tearful, getting flustered. He was not used to being cross-examined. "The container is metal. It's opaque to the X-ray. That's a violation of protocol," he insisted, falling back on the rulebook, his voice a little louder now, a little more defensive. Then the protocol would be to run a more advanced scan, would it not? An explosive trace detection swab on the exterior, perhaps, which you have already done on my other items and found nothing. Or to consult a supervisor for guidance on a sensitive item. What the protocol does not state, I am quite certain, is that the agent should engage in baseless, accusatory speculation and handle a personal, sacred object with open contempt. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. She was deconstructing his authority piece by piece, using the very regulations he claimed to be upholding. Callahan's face was now a mask of raw fury. She had turned his interrogation back on him. She had made him feel small, the very thing his grandmother had warned her against. He felt his control slipping, and he reacted by grabbing for the biggest lever of power he had left. "That's it. We're done here," he snarled. "You're being uncooperative." He looked past her, raising his voice. "I need a supervisor at Station 4. Possible undeclared substance, uncooperative passenger." The words were an explosion in the quiet tension. A few more heads turned. An older woman with a nervous expression quickly herded her grandchildren away. Documentation, 5:35 a.m. Agent Callahan falsely accuses me of being uncooperative. He has summoned a supervisor under false pretenses. Imani stood her ground, her body rigid with a controlled rage. Her mind was a whirlwind. The deposition. The flight was boarding in 20 minutes. This man, with his petty power trip, was not just humiliating her. He was actively sabotaging her ability to do her job, to fight for the clients who were depending on her. The injustice of it was a bitter pill. A moment later, another TSA employee arrived. He was older than Callahan, with a weary, resigned look on his face. His name tag read Henderson. He looked at Callahan, then at Imani, then at the scattered contents of her briefcase and the single silver cylinder on the table. "What's the situation, Mark?" Supervisor Henderson asked, his voice tired, as if this was the third such incident before sunrise. "Passenger has an unmarked sealed metal container," Callahan said, pointing. "She claims it's ashes, but it's against protocol. Can't be scanned. I told her we'd have to confiscate it for further testing. She became uncooperative and argumentative. It was a gross misrepresentation, a lie built on a sliver of truth." Henderson sighed and looked at Imani. "Ma'am, I understand this can be frustrating, but our officers are just following procedure. Metal containers like this are problematic." Imani met the supervisor's gaze. She saw a man who wasn't looking for justice, but for the path of least resistance. He wanted the problem to go away. She was the problem. "Supervisor Henderson," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. "Your agent is not just following procedure. He has been confrontational, accusatory, and has deliberately mishandled my personal and professional property. He has implied I am a liar and a potential criminal. He has now lied to you about my conduct. I have been nothing but cooperative. I have answered his questions. I have submitted to his search. What I have not done is allow him to bully me in silence." Henderson looked from Imani's resolute face to Callahan's smug, defiant one. He was caught in the middle, and he clearly didn't want to be. "Mark, did you swab the container?" Henderson asked. "I was about to before she started giving me lawyer talk," Callahan lied again. This was the moment, the final escalation, the point of no return. Imani knew that whatever happened next, the quiet routine of her morning was shattered. But something else was being forged in its place. A cold, hard resolve. This would not end here in this sterile alcove. "Supervisor Henderson," Imani said, her voice dropping the last vestiges of passenger-to-employee politeness. It was now the voice of Imani Jordan, Esquire. "Before this goes any further, I think you and Agent Callahan need to understand exactly what is happening here. This isn't a simple dispute over baggage." She reached into her now disheveled briefcase and pulled out a slim, leather-bound card holder. She extracted a business card and held it out to Henderson. He took it, his eyes glancing down at the text. His weary expression evaporated, replaced by a sudden, sharp intake of breath. His eyes widened. He read the card again, as if to make sure he wasn't mistaken. The card was simple, elegant, and devastating. Imani Jordan, SQ, Senior Litigator, National Civil Rights Coalition-led Counsel, Thompson v. City of Northgate. Henderson looked up from the card, his face pale. He looked at the formidable black woman in the power suit. He looked at her briefcase filled with files labeled federal litigation. He looked at the snarling, resentful agent next to him. And in that instant, he understood. This wasn't a passenger. This was a tactical nuke, and Agent Callahan had just pulled the pin. The small, sterile screening area, which a moment ago had felt like Callahan's kingdom, suddenly felt like a cage. The air crackled with a new kind of tension. It was no longer the friction between an officer and a traveler. It was the deafening silence before a lightning strike. Supervisor Henderson held Imani's business card as if it were a lit piece of dynamite. He looked from the embossed letters to Imani's unblinking eyes, and a wave of dawning horror washed over his face. The National Civil Rights Coalition was not some small-time outfit. They were giants, legal titans who took on entire government departments and won. And Thompson v. City of Northgate was a headline case, a legal battle sending shockwaves through law enforcement circles nationwide. He looked at Callahan, whose smugness was just beginning to curdle into confusion. He hadn't seen the card yet. He just saw his supervisor's sudden panic. "What is it?" Callahan demanded, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Just some business card." Henderson didn't answer him. He swallowed hard and looked at Imani, his tone transformed from weary impatience to urgent deference. "Miss Jordan, I apologize. There appears to have been a misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding, Supervisor Henderson," Imani replied, her voice as cold and sharp as surgical steel. "There has been a deliberate and targeted abuse of authority, and it has been performed by your agent under your supervision." She turned her gaze to Callahan. It was time. "Agent Callahan," she said, and his head snapped towards her, annoyed at her tone. "For the past 15 minutes you have detained me without cause. You have conducted an invasive search for no reason other than, by your own admission, my bag looked suspicious. You have handled my personal belongings with contempt. You have desecrated a sacred memento of my deceased grandmother. You have implied I am a criminal. You have lied to your superior about my conduct. You have attempted to sabotage my ability to attend a critical legal proceeding." She paused, letting the weight of each charge settle in the silent air. "My name is Imani Jordan. I am a civil rights attorney. In fact, I am the lead counsel in a major federal lawsuit against a government entity for precisely this kind of behavior, using the color of authority to engage in racial profiling and harassment." She took a small step closer, her presence seeming to fill the entire space. "And you, Agent Callahan, in your official capacity as an employee of the Transportation Security Administration, have just provided me with a textbook example. You haven't just inconvenienced a passenger, you have created an incident, and I assure you, there will be a record." Callahan stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The word civil rights attorney hit him like a physical blow. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, mottled gray. The bulldog posture sagged. The glint in his eye was extinguished, replaced by the flickering flame of panic. He finally understood the look on Henderson's face. He looked at the business card still in his supervisor's hand, then back at Imani. It was like a switch had been flipped. He was no longer the gatekeeper. He was the defendant. "Now," Imani continued, her voice radiating an authority that dwarfed theirs, "this is what is going to happen. First, you are going to immediately cease this unlawful search and return all of my property, including the silver reliquary you have so crudely handled." She looked at Henderson. "Second, you're going to provide me with your full name and badge number, and the full name and badge number of Agent Callahan. Third, you are going to file an official incident report detailing everything that has occurred here, and I will be requesting a copy of that report. Fourth, you are going to provide me with the contact information for the senior TSA official at this airport, and the direct contact for the Department of Homeland Security's Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. She wasn't asking. She was instructing. She had transformed the screening area into her courtroom. Henderson was fumbling for a pen, his hands shaking slightly. "Yes, of course, right away, Miss Jordan." He shot a venomous glare at Callahan. "Mark, put her things back. Now, carefully." Callahan seemed frozen, his mind unable to process the complete reversal of power. He stared at Imani's briefcase, at the files he had so carelessly disrupted. Each one now seemed like a loaded weapon pointed directly at him. I was just following procedure," he stammered, the words sounding weak and pathetic even to his own ears. It was the last refuge of a scoundrel, and Imani was having none of it. "You were not following procedure, Agent Callahan. You were indulging a personal prejudice," she corrected him, her voice merciless. "Procedure is for security. What you did was an act of aggression, and a government employee who cannot tell the difference is a liability the government cannot afford." The threat was clear, precise, and devastating. With trembling fingers, Callahan began placing the files back into Imani's briefcase. His earlier swaggering movements were gone, replaced by a clumsy, fearful haste. He picked up the silver cylinder, holding it now as if it were radioactive. He placed it gently into its pouch. Henderson was scribbling furiously on a small notepad. "My name is David Henderson, badge number 7822. His is Mark Callahan, badge 9410. I'll file the report immediately, Miss Jordan, and I'll get you those phone numbers." He scurried off to a nearby podium, leaving Callahan alone with Imani. The agent refused to meet her eyes. He was focused on closing her briefcase, his face a miserable portrait of fear and regret. The power he had so enjoyed wielding had turned out to be a phantom, an illusion that shattered the moment it was truly challenged. He wasn't a gatekeeper. He was just a man in a cheap uniform who had picked the wrong fight. Imani looked at her watch. Her flight was in its final boarding stages. This had cost her precious time, but it had also ignited a fire in her. The deposition in D.C. was about systemic injustice, and here, in this airport, she had just experienced a raw, personal taste of it. It was no longer just a case, it was a crusade. Henderson hurried back, holding out a slip of paper with names and numbers. "Miss Jordan, on behalf of the TSA, I am profoundly sorry for the agent's conduct. It was unprofessional, unacceptable." "Yes, it was," Imani said, taking the paper. "And sorry is not going to be sufficient. You can expect to hear from my office." She latched her briefcase, the click sounding like a gavel. She gathered her things with her usual efficiency, her composure fully restored but now overlaid with a layer of tempered steel. She walked away from the screening area without a backward glance, leaving the two men in the ruins of their mourning. Henderson turned on Callahan, his voice a furious whisper. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? Do you?" Callahan could only shake his head, staring at the empty space where Imani Jordan had stood. He had wanted to make her feel small. Instead, she had made him feel microscopic. And he had the sickening feeling that his world was about to get a whole lot smaller. Imani boarded the plane just as the flight attendant was about to close the door. She found her seat in business class, slid her briefcase under the seat in front of her, and buckled her seatbelt. The practiced movements were automatic, but her mind was a raging torrent. As the plane pushed back from the gate, the adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation began to ebb, and the full weight of the encounter settled upon her. The humiliation, the raw, undisguised prejudice, the violation of her privacy, and the desecration of her grandmother's memory. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a deep and personal wound. A single hot tear traced a path down her cheek, a crack in the dam of her composure. She wiped it away, not with sadness, but with anger. The anger was clean, pure, and energizing. It was fuel. She took out her phone, switched it to airplane mode, and opened a new note. Her memory was eidetic when it came to legal matters, a skill honed over years of practice. She began to type, her fingers flying across the screen. Incident report. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, Concourse T, Security Checkpoint South. Date, today's date. Time, approx 5:20 a.m. to 5:40 a.m. She detailed everything. Agent Callahan's exact words, his physical actions during the pat-down, the order in which he searched her bags, his specific absurd question about her facial cream, his fixation on the silver reliquary, his lies to Supervisor Henderson. Every detail was a nail she intended to hammer into his professional coffin. This was no longer just a complaint. It was discovery for a lawsuit, her own. As the plane climbed above the clouds, breaking through into the brilliant morning sun, Imani felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. Callahan hadn't just harassed a black woman. He had harassed an attorney who had the resources, the knowledge, and the will to hold him in the system that employed him accountable. He thought he was punching down. He had, in fact, punched a hornet's nest. Back in the fluorescent-lit purgatory of the TSA checkpoint, Mark Callahan was sweating. Henderson had pulled him off the line and into a small, windowless break room that smelled of stale microwave popcorn. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately," Henderson said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. He was in full damage control mode. "Hand over your badge and your airport credentials." "Leave? For what?" Callahan protested, his voice cracking. "I was doing my job. The container was suspicious." "The container held ashes, you idiot," Henderson hissed, his face inches from Callahan's. "And the woman you decided to play tough guy with is one of the most prominent civil rights lawyers in the country. Do you know what she does for a living? She sues people like you. She sues organizations like us. She eats smug, power-tripping bullies for breakfast, and you served yourself up on a silver platter." Callahan flinched. The reality was crashing down on him, and it was a tidal wave. She was mouthy. She had an attitude. "She has a law degree from Harvard, Mark. Her attitude is called knowing her rights. A concept you might want to brush up on, assuming you still have a job to come back to." Henderson spat. He snatched the badge from Callahan's shirt. "Go home. Don't talk to anyone. And get a lawyer. You're going to need one." Callahan walked out of the airport, not through the passenger areas, but through the sterile employee corridors in the building's guts. Stripped of his uniform and badge, he felt naked and powerless. The authority he had craved and abused had been a costume, and it had just been ripped away. The smug satisfaction he'd felt just an hour earlier had curdled into a cold, hard knot of terror in his stomach. He had a mortgage, a car payment. He thought of his wife and the way she already looked at him with a tired disappointment. This would be the final straw. He had tried to ruin Imani Jordan's morning, and in doing so, he had detonated his own life. The moment her plane landed at Reagan National, Imani switched off airplane mode. Her phone buzzed to life with a dozen emails about the Northgate deposition. But she ignored them. She made one call. "David," she said when her partner answered. David Chen, a brilliant and notoriously relentless investigator and second chair on her legal team, picked up on the first ring. "Imani, you landed. How was the flight?" "The flight was fine. The security check was not," she said, her voice tight. "Clear your afternoon. We have a new case." She recounted the entire incident, her voice a low, steady monotone that belied the fury beneath. David listened without interruption, the silence on his end punctuated only by the furious sound of his own typing. He was already opening files, starting research. Callahan, Mark. Badge 9410. Henderson, David. Badge 7822. David repeated. "Got it. I'm pulling up the DHS employee database. What do you want to do?" "I want to burn them to the ground," Imani said, the raw emotion finally bleeding through. Respectfully, and within the full purview of the law, of course. A grim smile touched David's lips. He knew that tone. It was the tone she used when a case became personal. It was her most dangerous weapon. "Then let's get the fire started," he said. "I'll draft the initial complaint to the DHS office for civil rights and civil liberties. We'll allege violations under the Fourth Amendment for unlawful search and seizure, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 for discrimination based on race. I'll also file an immediate Freedom of Information Act request. I want Callahan's complete employment record. Disciplinary actions, complaints filed against him, the works. I want to see how many times he's pulled a random secondary screening on a woman of color versus a white male. Good, Imani said. I want to establish a pattern of behavior. This wasn't an isolated incident. I felt it. It was practiced. I'll also look into Henderson, David added. See how many complaints have been filed on his shift. Supervisors are responsible for the culture they oversee. If he let Callahan run wild, he's complicit. Exactly, Imani said. She was now in a cab, speeding towards the law firm where the deposition would be held. The incident had rattled her, but it had also sharpened her focus. The fight against the Northgate PD and her fight against Agent Callahan were two fronts in the same war. It was a war against the casual, brutal abuse of power by those in uniform. Get it all, David, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Everything. I want to know where this man went to high school. I want to know if he was ever sued before. I want to know what he eats for breakfast. I want to know every single skeleton in his closet, because I'm going to drag it out into the sunlight for the entire world to see. The call ended. Imani looked out the window at the monuments of Washington, D.C. gliding past. They were symbols of justice, of a nation built on laws. But she knew better than anyone that laws were only as strong as the people willing to fight for them. Agent Callahan had wanted to know what was in her silver container. He was about to find out what was in her briefcase. And it wasn't just paper. It was righteous fury, backed by the full, crushing weight of the United States legal code. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and they were about to roll right over him. In the weeks that followed, Imani Jordan's life was a study in controlled fury. By day, she was the consummate professional, meticulously deposing witnesses and dismantling the legal fortifications of the Northgate Police Department. Her focus during the Thompson case was absolute, her questioning precise and lethal. But in the evenings, fueled by coffee and a cold, burning anger, she and David Chen opened the second front, the war against Agent Mark Callahan and the institutional rot he represented. The first volley was the official complaint, a 20-page document detailing the incident in excruciating, legally flawless detail. It was sent not only to the DHS Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, but also to the chairs of the House and Senate Homeland Security Committees, and to the director of the TSA. It was not a plea for an apology. It was a declaration of intent. The second and more damaging volley was the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, request. David Chen, a man who treated information retrieval as an art form, crafted a request so specific and comprehensive that it left the TSA's lawyers with no room to wriggle out. He didn't just ask for Callahan's file. He asked for anonymized data on every secondary screening conducted at Callahan's checkpoint for the past 2 years, cross-referenced by the agent on duty and the perceived race and gender of the passenger. The bureaucracy moved at a glacial pace, but David was relentless, following up with phone calls and emails that were polite, persistent, and carried the implicit threat of a court order to compel production. Meanwhile, Mark Callahan's world was shrinking. His administrative leave was a euphemism for purgatory. He sat at home, the silence of the house deafening. His wife's disappointed glances had morphed into a cold, contemptuous silence. She knew he'd been suspended, and his blustering, self-pitying explanations about a disrespectful passenger and political correctness gone mad were met with a stony lack of sympathy. He felt the phantom weight of his badge on his shirt, a constant reminder of the power he had lost. His union-appointed lawyer was a weary, overworked man who offered little comfort. "Look, Mark," the lawyer had said over the phone, "your case is a dog. You picked the wrong person. Best we can hope for is they let you resign quietly to avoid a bigger mess." Resign? The thought was terrifying. The TSA job, as much as he complained about it, was all he had. It was his last vestige of the authority he'd lost when he washed out of the police academy. And that was the secret David Chen was about to uncover. The first batch of FOIA documents arrived at Imani's office 3 weeks after the incident. It was a thick manila envelope, and inside was the ammunition they needed. David spread the documents across a conference table, his eyes gleaming. "Bingo," David said, pointing to a column of data. "Here it is, the pattern." The data was stark. Over the past 24 months, the checkpoint where Callahan worked had a random secondary screening rate of 6%. However, on the shifts when Callahan was the primary agent flagging passengers, that rate jumped to 11%. But the most damning statistic was the demographic breakdown. Of the passengers Callahan personally selected for additional screening, 78% were people of color. Of that group, nearly 90% were women. "It's not just a pattern," Imani said, her voice low and grim. "It's a hunting ground. He was using his position to target and harass women of color specifically." "It gets worse," David said, turning to another page. It was Callahan's complaint history. There were 4 prior complaints filed against him, 2 for unprofessional conduct, 1 for aggressive language, and a 4th that had been dismissed. All 4 had been filed by black women. "They knew," Imani whispered, a fresh wave of anger rising in her. The TSA had a record of his behavior. They had 4 separate warnings that this man had a problem with black women, and they did nothing. They let him stay on the front lines, badge and authority intact. They are not just complicit, they are negligent. This changed everything. It was no longer just about Callahan's individual actions. It was about systemic failure, the very thing she was fighting in the Thompson case. The final piece of the puzzle came from a different source. David, on a hunch, had run a deep background check on Callahan, including his sealed juvenile records and his employment history. He found it. Callahan's brief, failed attempt to become a police officer in a small Georgia town called Oakhaven, a decade earlier. David made a few calls. He found a retired Oakhaven police chief, a man willing to speak off the record. "Mark Callahan?" The old chief had grumbled over the phone. "Yeah, I remember that hothead. Had a real chip on his shoulder. Thought the badge made him a king. We had to let him go during his probationary period. He pulled over a car with 2 black teenagers, claimed he smelled marijuana. Tore their car apart on the side of the road, found nothing. The dad was a local pastor. Raised holy hell. We reviewed the dashcam footage. Callahan had been baiting them, trying to provoke a reaction. His excuse? He had a gut feeling. We told him we run a police department, not a psychic hotline. The kid had a prejudice problem a mile wide. We knew he'd be a lawsuit waiting to happen." David relayed the story to Imani. She sat back in her chair, connecting the dots. A failed cop with a history of racial profiling, who then gets a job with federal authority, where he continues the exact same behavior, targeting the same demographic, until he finally harasses a woman who has the power to expose him. The karma wasn't just coming, it was a tidal wave of his own making, building for over a decade. Imani leaned forward. "The negligence case just became ironclad, but I want more than just a settlement. I want him to understand the consequences of his actions. David, find out if he's tried to get back into law enforcement." It was a long shot, but David was a master of digging. He discovered that Callahan, even while working for the TSA, had been putting out applications to various local police departments. He was desperate to get back what he had lost, to trade his blue TSA shirt for a proper police uniform. And then David found the crown jewel. An application, submitted 2 months ago, still pending. "You're not going to believe this," David said, walking into Imani's office with a printout. "Mark Callahan has a pending application with the Northgate Police Department." Imani stared at him, speechless. Northgate, the very department she was currently suing for having a culture of officers exactly like Mark Callahan. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost poetic. Callahan wasn't just a random bigot. He was an aspiring member of the very organization whose systemic bigotry she was fighting to dismantle in court. He was trying to join the brotherhood of officers who had harassed, assaulted, and discriminated against the 100 families she represented. A slow, cold smile spread across Imani's face. It was not a smile of joy, but of vindication, the kind of smile a grandmaster has when she sees the entire board and knows with absolute certainty that checkmate is only 5 moves away. "David," she said, her voice calm and clear, "get the Oak Haven police chief on the record. Get a sworn affidavit. Then I want you to send a copy of our entire file, the FOIA data, the prior complaints, the affidavit from Oak Haven, everything to 2 people." "Who?" "My opposing counsel in the Thompson case," Imani said, "and the head of internal affairs at the Northgate Police Department, with a cover letter from me." The hard karma was about to hit, and it wasn't just going to cost Callahan his job. It was going to salt the earth of his ambitions, ensuring that he could never again wear a badge and abuse the public trust. The delivery of the file was a strategic masterstroke. It landed on the polished mahogany desk of Alan Spiro, lead defense counsel for the city of Northgate, with a quiet thud that reverberated like a cannon shot. Spiro, a notoriously unflappable corporate lawyer, read Imani's cover letter, then began sifting through the attached documents. His face, usually a mask of professional indifference, cycled through surprise, then concern, then outright alarm. He was looking at a meticulously documented profile of a man his client was actively considering hiring. A man with a documented history of racial bias, aggressive behavior, and a prior dismissal from another law enforcement agency for the exact same conduct. A man who had then gone on to harass opposing counsel in their own case. It was a public relations nightmare, a legal landmine, and a gift-wrapped piece of evidence for Imani's class action suit. It demonstrated that Northgate P.D. quote, "S bad apples weren't just a thing of the past. They were actively trying to get in the front door." A similar package arrived at the desk of Lieutenant Valerick, the stern, by-the-book head of Northgate's internal affairs. For him, the file wasn't just a problem. It was an indictment of his department's hiring practices. How had this man's record not raised 1,000 red flags? The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Mark Callahan. He received a call not from the TSA, but from the Northgate Police Department. It was a curt, formal notification that his application had been rejected. When he, in a panic, tried to ask why, the clerk on the other end simply said, "The file is closed, sir," and hung up. The next call was from his union lawyer. It was even worse. "It's over, Mark," the lawyer said, his voice flat. "They're terminating you for cause. Gross misconduct, violations of the code of conduct, you name it, they're throwing it at you. My advice? Don't fight it. If you do, they'll make this whole thing public. The complaints, the data, the Oak Haven incident, all of it." Callahan's world imploded. But that was supposed to be sealed, the Oak Haven thing. "Apparently the lawyer you harassed is better at unsealing things than we are at keeping them locked up," the lawyer replied dryly. "You poked a sleeping dragon, Mark. Now you're burnt to a crisp." The termination was just the beginning of the karma. The true crushing blow was the permanent black mark on his record. With a formal termination for cause from a federal agency and the now documented history of racial bias, he was utterly unemployable in any field of law enforcement. The dream he had so desperately clung to, of wearing a real cop's uniform, of regaining that sense of authority, was not just dead. Its grave had been paved over with concrete. He was a pariah. The final turn of the screw came a week later. The story, leaked by a source within the TSA who was fed up with the agency's inaction, was picked up by a national news outlet. Civil rights attorney suing police for bias becomes target of TSA profiling. The article detailed the entire event, including the data from the FOIA request showing Callahan's undeniable pattern of targeting women of color. He became a face for the petty tyrants of the world. His sour, bulldog-like face plastered next to a picture of the poised, formidable Imani Jordan. He couldn't go to the grocery store without people recognizing him, whispering and shaking their heads in disgust. The public shame was a prison from which he could never escape. His wife finally left, unable to bear the humiliation. He was alone in a house he could no longer afford, his life a smoking crater of his own making. For Imani, the victory was layered and deeply satisfying. Her complaint forced the TSA to make tangible changes. They settled with her out of court, but the terms were not primarily financial. They agreed to a mandatory, agency-wide retraining program on implicit bias and de-escalation, designed and overseen by a third-party civil rights organization. Supervisor Henderson was demoted and reassigned to a desk job. Callahan was gone. Her personal humiliation had been leveraged to create systemic change, the ultimate goal of her life's work. In the Thompson v. City of Northgate case, the Callahan file was a turning point. It fatally undermined the city's defense that their problem was in the past. It proved the culture of bias was ongoing. Faced with this new, explosive evidence, the city's lawyers approached Imani with a settlement offer far greater than anything they had previously considered. It included substantial financial compensation for the 100 families. But more importantly, it mandated a federal consent decree to oversee the department's hiring, training, and disciplinary practices for the next decade. It was a monumental victory. Months later, long after the news cycle had moved on, Imani sat in her quiet office. The settlement papers for both cases were framed on her wall. On her desk sat the small silver cylinder containing her grandmother's ashes, returned to its place of honor. She looked at the cracked face of her father's watch on her wrist. He had faced injustice with a quiet, weary resignation. He had believed the system was too big to fight. Imani had taken the pain of her family's past and forged it into a weapon for the future. She had not just won a case or gotten a man fired. She had proven that a single determined individual, armed with the law and an unshakable belief in justice, could dismantle the petty thrones of tyrants. Mark Callahan had tried to strip her of her dignity, to make her feel powerless and small. Instead, he had reminded her of her own strength. He had handed her a new sword, and she had used it to change the world, one righteous fight at a time. The gatekeeper had been vanquished, not by shouting or by rage, but by the cold, clear, and inescapable power of the law. And that was the hardest karma of all. The story of Imani Jordan and Agent Callahan is a stark reminder that the abuse of power often happens not in the halls of Congress, but in the everyday spaces where we live our lives. It's a testament to the fact that the most powerful weapon against injustice is knowledge, courage, and the refusal to be made small. But stories like this only have an impact if they are heard. By liking this video, you help the algorithm show it to more people. By sharing it, you spread the message that accountability matters. And by subscribing, you support our mission to continue telling these vital stories of struggle, vindication, and the enduring fight for civil rights. What did you think of Imani's strategy? Have you ever witnessed a subtle abuse of power like this? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching and for being part of the conversation.